Okay, folks, I am going to be doing a tiny little bit of review and moving us forward so that we can stay caught up and take our quiz on Wednesday. So the last time that we were together, I think we had talked a little bit, we'd reviewed the piano concerto and what double exposition concerto form is and how it is the same as and how it is different from sonata form. So we had reviewed that, and essentially it's the idea that it's just like a sonata form, sorry, um, except that in standard sonata form we have one exposition, the A and the B, that is repeated literally. But in double exposition concerto form, there's like two different expositions. There's one for the orchestra and one for the soloist and the orchestra together. In a regular sonata form, we have like our A and our B. We've got the first stuff that's in the tonic key or the original key, and then we have a key that goes away from the tonic, and then that whole thing is repeated just all over again. In a double exposition concerto form, first exposition is just for the orchestra by itself, and it stays in the tonic the whole time. In the second exposition, where the soloist and the orchestra play together, that's where it modulates to the new key area. So in a double exposition concerto form, you have to have the soloist playing in order to modulate to that new key place. Just like in a sonata form, the development, it's the same. The tonic key, it's just all over the place. We develop the themes that we got introduced to in the exposition. In the recapitulation, it's the same. It all goes back to just like the beginning, except that now everything is in the tonic key or the original key. Whoop, sorry about that. In a standard sonata form, there is no cadenza because there's no soloist to take one. But at the end of the recapitulation in a double exposition concerto form, it's time for the soloist to show off. It's an improvisation on themes that we've heard earlier, and there's no accompaniment at all from the orchestra. We remember that there's like a big old trill to let the orchestra know, hey, it's time for you to come back. And they have a coda that is played just by the orchestra only, in a double exposition concerto form. In a standard sonata form, there may or may not be a coda. Sometimes there is one, sometimes there is not one. It just kind of depends. All right, so then we moved on to The Marriage of Figaro, and we watched the trio Cosa Cento, and we went over who the characters are and what their motivations are and what they're doing. Just a quick review of that. Susanna is the character that we're most concerned with in this scene. She's a major part of the action. She is aware that the Count wants to sleep with her. This is no good because she doesn't want to sleep with the Count. She's getting married to Figaro today. She is also the Countess's maid. She and the Countess have a great friendship with one another, and she definitely doesn't want to have to sleep with the Countess's husband. The Countess isn't really into that either. Also, neither is Figaro. He's not interested in the Count sleeping with his future wife. So nobody on this team, Team Susanna, I guess, is really interested in the Count being able to sleep with Susanna. Count Almaviva, on the other hand, he is married to the Countess. I mean, he loves his wife, but he also wants to be able to go out there and sow his wild oats. He has his eyes on Susanna, and he needs to be really crafty about the way that he pursues her because he's come out in public and said that he doesn't obey the feudal law. What this means, there used to be a feudal law that allowed wealthy landowners and people with titles or noble blood, like a count or a duke or a prince or a king, etc., to be able to sleep with a lady who has just been married before her husband. It's a privilege for him as a noble man. Now, he has come out publicly and said, yeah, I don't do that. That's not a thing that I'm going to do. I obey the natural law where the husband and the wife sleep together, and I don't pursue a married lady. But he kind of wants to forego that rule when it comes to Susanna. He's just got a thing for her. Now, Don Basilio, who is the music teacher, he's meddlesome. He gossips about everything. He is on Team Count. He is just part of he knows that the Count wants to sleep with Susanna, and he's kind of all about it. He is a suck up, and he wants to help the Count meet his goal. And there's another lady that we don't see in this scene. Her name is Marcellina. She's also on Team Count. So we have these two teams that are aware of each other. They know what the other team is trying to do, but they don't talk about it. They just sort of try to counteract the other team's actions to try and make things come out their way. There is another character who's on stage who we see at the very beginning. His name is Cherubino. He's a 15 or 16-year-old or so boy who is a page for the Count. And he is like many 15 or 16-year-old boys. He's just out there trying to sow his own wild oats. He's very interested in talking to all the ladies at court. Sometimes he's good at it, sometimes he's bad at it. There's one lady in particular, her name is Barbarina, that he's very interested in. And unfortunately, the Count likes Barbarina as well. That's a lady that he visits on a regular basis. Unfortunately, the Count has caught Cherubino at Barbarina's. And so the Count is not very happy with Cherubino, and he wants to send him away. He wants to kick him out of court and put him in the army, which is not good for Cherubino. That's not what he wants. So he has come to Susanna to try and get her to step in and help him out. He has said, "Hey, Susanna, can you talk to the Countess for me and see whether or not she'll save me? She can talk to the Count and sort of maybe soften him a little bit and make him not kick me out, make him not fire me and send me to the army instead. Will you do that?" But unfortunately, what happens on stage is that the Count comes into Susanna's room. He wants to put the moves on her and pursue her. And so Cherubino has to hide. And so, yeah, it's no good. But Susanna doesn't want the Count there at all because Susanna knows that the Count is trying to seduce her. And then Basilio comes in. He's just there to stir up trouble and gossip. So we see Cherubino and Susanna. In class, we watched this whole thing. Just an idea. Cherubino doesn't have anywhere to go, so he just hides.
Mi sembri agitata e confusa.
Signore, io chiedo scusa, ma se mai mi sorpresa per carità.
Un momento e ti lascio, ho detto
No.
due parole.
Now, Susanna just wants him out of there for several reasons. One, Cherubino's right here.
Signor Susassi.
Parla.
He's putting it on really thick.
Ama la moglie od il marito per dir che il conte va.
Sorti che vi ministro dell'altro infrequenza. Io non ho dopo delle vostre parole del conte del suo amore.
Non c'è alcun male.
So Basilio was there to try and stir up trouble. He's like, hey, why would you want to sleep with the Count's servant? Why do you want to marry Figaro instead of just sleep with the Count? I mean, come on. What lady wouldn't choose to sleep with a nobleman instead of, just a servant? And Susanna doesn't want to hear any of his crap. She wants him to leave too, because now, of course, we know that Cherubino is hiding on the front part of the chair, covered by the dress, and the Count is hiding behind the chair listening to Don Basilio. Now, Don Basilio has no idea that the Count is there, so he goes on to sort of say some maybe not appropriate things about Cherubino and the Countess, sort of implying that Cherubino has a thing for the Countess. Now, even though the Count is interested in sleeping with all of these other women, he's not interested in anybody else pursuing his wife. That's his wife. He doesn't want anybody else fooling around with her. Not that he questions her, but he doesn't like the idea of Cherubino, who he's already pretty salty with, making eyes at his wife. So, it all comes out. What ends up happening is that Basilio realizes, oh no, the Count is here. I've said all of this stuff. I've been spouting all of this gossip and bullcrap. What am I going to do? I need to apologize. But he's also thrilled because he's caught the Count in Susanna's room. All of this is no good for Susanna.
Perdonate, oh mio signor.
Cherubino, Bebesino, sono preso davanti al trono.
Ma scusate, parle.
Al punto.
Sì,
Perdonate, oh mio.
Bebesino, Bebesino, sono presa dal trono. Sono presa dal trono.
Just give
So Susanna's kind of humiliated. She's been caught with this man in her room on her wedding day. And people are talking about the fact that the Count wants to pursue her. This is no good. So she doesn't feel good about any of it.
Landelino,
Poverino, poverino,
poverino, ma non è sorpresa ancora.
So the Count is going to tell the both of them now about how he caught Cherubino at Barbarina's house. He does this.
Sio, alzando, piano Mario, il vedo al tavolino, vedo il giorno. Ma cosa peggio?
meglio ancora.
So the gossip gets the good stuff. The lady gets the bad stuff. So now Susanna is just doubly humiliated because now Cherubino's been caught in her room. All of this looks bad. The Count is going to be super angry. One, because now he thinks that Susanna is rejecting him because she's sleeping with Cherubino. That's not true, but that's his immediate suspicion. So none of this is good. So Susanna tries to explain herself after the trio is over.
Ma costui cosa bene?
Egli era venuto quando voi qui giungeste e mi chiedeva di vedere la padrona in tercede di grazia. Il vostro arrivo inscombine lo pose e dalla lingua dopo si nascose.
Ma se io stesso m'assisi quando entrava mai.
E dal muro del dietro e mi cenai.
E quando io non mi posi.
Allora io più mi posi e me la storia.
C'è dunque sentito quello che io ti dicevo.
Which is no good. The Count is now even more determined to get rid of Cherubino because now Cherubino has heard the Count putting the moves on Susanna. Not good.
Non sei qui, ma dopo mia.
Ah, è figlio!
Frenatevi, niente.
Voi restate qui, chi c'ho serpente!
All of these people come in, and what happens is that Figaro and all these maidens come in and they say, all right, Count, you've said that you don't obey the feudal law, but the natural law. Dress the bride in a symbol of her purity, that little white veil that he's carrying. Well, what ends up happening is that the Count says, oh, of course, you guys can get married, no problem. But I need all of my courtiers here first before we can have a wedding celebration. He needs to try and get somebody to intercede so that Figaro can't marry Susanna because he needs this to happen. He's going to try and circumvent their wedding in a way that doesn't let Figaro marry Susanna so that he can sleep with her. So that's the whole gist. That's kind of what we did the last time that we were together. We talked a little bit about some of Mozart's other operas. The Magic Flute is kind of nuts. It's one of the last ones that Mozart writes. It's very successful, but it's also a little bit crazy. Women Are That Way, Così fan tutte, which is essentially about two women who are engaged to two men. The two men make a bet with a third man The third man says, those women will fall for anybody. If you guys left, it would just be two other men that would be able to woo them. So the two men who are engaged to the two women leave, come back in disguise, and woo their former girlfriends to see whether or not man 3 was correct. Turns out man 3 is correct. And then we know that Orpheus had previously been set by Monteverdi, but a guy from the classical era, Gluck, he said, you know what, that's a great story. I want to write an opera about that. So he does, but it's definitely going to sound a little bit more like a Mozart opera than like Monteverdi's opera. We know that Baroque opera and classical opera sound a lot different, and so this is much more. It is a great classical era opera. All right, so William Billings, he's our last guy. This is the last bit of our unit on the classical. He is our first American-born composer. He was born in what would later become the United States in 1746. In 1746, of course, though, it was a British colony. But he's born in Boston and trained as a tanner. That is somebody who works with, like, leather, makes leather and things of that nature. So you know that that is actually a pretty lucrative career during this time, but pretty dangerous. You work with a lot of very caustic chemicals and things that aren't really that healthy for you. But he supported the revolution to become a separate place from a British colony. He was good friends with Paul Revere. He wrote the New England Psalm Singer. It is the first published collection of musical works by a native-born composer in the United States. This New England Psalm Singer was actually really popular because congregations did a lot of the singing in Protestant churches in the United States. They didn't have, monks and a lot of clergy who would make up choirs. It was the people who would sing. And so the New England Psalm Singer was full of hymns and things that were designed to help the congregation sing. It was very popular during its time. But the interesting thing about that was that he couldn't support himself as a composer because there were no copyright laws governing what would become the United States at that time. So he wrote over 300 compositions, including those in the New England Psalm Singer, but he really could not profit from them. So he ended up dying in poverty. Very sad. But posthumously, meaning after his death, he was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. He has received a lot of credit for the great work that he did during his life, but unfortunately this all came after he had passed. So we talked a little bit about Revolution songs and how things, even like the Marriage of Figaro, the opera, had contributed to the ideas of revolution. We had listened to a little bit of La Marseillaise, which is the French national anthem. And we had mentioned that Chester, the song that we're going to listen to, is sort of like a revolution song. You've heard Yankee Doodle probably before, and some people know that it actually sort of started off as a satire of people who wanted to break away from Britain. But a lot of people who supported that cause kind of adopted it as an anthem, sort of a way of saying, well, you think this is insulting, but we don't find it insulting, so we're just going to sing it and use it as a source of pride. Chester, on the other hand, is sort of all about how the colonies kind of beat up on Britain. You'll see that in the text. And it was popular during the American Revolution. So the words and music of Chester, written by Billings, of course, were written in the U.S. by a U.S. native. He had taught himself how to compose, and because he wrote the New England Psalm Singer, which is full of essentially hymns, Chester will sound a lot like a hymn to you. There's a lot of places for people who would sing this to breathe, somewhat like a hymn. If you've ever sang in a congregation before, you know that about, every 4 measures of music or so, you have the opportunity to take a breath. It's not meant for professional singers to sing. There are a couple of melismas, meaning lots of pitches on one syllable of text, but you'll hear that the text is mostly syllabic. Our book says that the text is secular, but I think we'll find when we actually look at the text that it's not really. They mention God a lot in the 5 verses. So it's also going to use a lot of antecedent and consequent phrases. You'll hear throughout the structure of the hymn, if you imagine the structure of a hymn as having 4 lines or 4 phrases, you're going to hear antecedent, 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 and then consequent. So unfinished, 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 finished there at the end. So we're going to, actually for the sake of being able to read the text as we go through, I'm not going to use the Blackboard version. I'm going to use the My Music Lab version because it is going to have the text there. Shush. All right. Go to Music Survey D. Shush, I don't care. We're going to go to Active Listening Guides. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger. There we go. Chester. It's a little song, kind of like a hymn. Oh my. All right. So the other thing that you'll hear is that the texture is going to change. At first it's just going to be men singing in the first verse. Then in verse 2, there's going to be one lady's part that joins. In verse 3, there will be another lady's part that joins. So we'll have 4 parts singing. And then in verse 4 and 5, all 4 parts will sing, but they'll probably add some counter melodies, particularly here in verse 5. All right, so let's give it a play.
Let tyrants shake their iron rod, and slavery clang her galling chains. We fear them not, we trust in God. New England's power forever reigns.
So as we go through, it gets a little bit more complex because at first when the sopranos joined, they just sang the melody too with the tenors. So that was kind of interesting. If you're wondering who these people are, Howe, Burgoyne, Clinton, Prescott, and Cornwallis, those are all British generals. So when they say, all those guys, they tried to overthrow our plot in an infernal league. So they're not cool. We don't like them. But then their ranks were broken, their lines were forced, their ships were sunk, shattered, or driven from the coast. When they say haughty stride, it just means like overconfident. Martial noise is warlike noise, and this is an insult to them. Their veterans flee before our youth, and generals yield to beardless boys. That essentially just means they have this big old trained army and everything. And, what do we have? Just simple farmers, boys, and they surrendered to us. So, yay. So it's a song all about the American Revolution. Sounds a lot like a hymn. Even though the text says that it is secular, it kind of is and it kind of isn't at the same time. So we had antecedent, 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 consequent. And in the original work, which is not exactly what we heard here, Billings wrote out full parts for all four voices, where the melody was always in the tenor voice. So the recording that we listened to, it's a little different from the original. So we have tenor and bass, tenor bass soprano, tenor bass soprano and alto, tenor bass soprano and alto, all the way through verses 4 and 5. But to my ear, it almost kind of sounds like there's an alto part here in verse 2 as well. But I think the book, yeah, I think the book kind of fudges that a little bit. But in any case, that is everything that we've got going on here in the classical. So on Wednesday, we are going to take a group quiz. I have come up with a quiz all about the classical era. I am not going to post the PowerPoint, and the reason why is because I'm letting you guys like group think and use your brains together, all y'all's brains together, to answer these questions. And so what I don't want to have happen is people just pulling up their computers and looking up all the answers on the PowerPoint online. That's no fun. And it doesn't really show me what you know or how well I'm teaching or how well I'm reaching you as a student. So that's what I'm going to do. But in any case, look over. Essentially, you want to know all about the forms that we've talked about. Sonata form is probably an important thing that we've talked about. Maybe some of the major ensembles. We know a little bit about the orchestra during this time and symphonies. We've talked about movements in symphonies. What's a minuet? What's a double exposition concerto form? How is it different from a sonata form? What are some overall characteristics of the classical, maybe when compared to things like the Baroque or whatever? Do you know the difference between binary, rounded binary, and ternary form? Who are the composers that we've studied? There have only been 3 total, so maybe know a little bit about them. Not so much about facts about their lives. Like, I don't care if you know when Mozart died or when Haydn died or any of that stuff. I mostly just care that you know what their music is about. What kind of music did they write? What were they famous for? We know that string quartets and symphonies kind of go with Haydn. He's a big deal when it comes to that. Good night. What else did I write in that quiz? Well, you should definitely know what the string quartet is. I mean, that was on our midterm, and we're definitely going to have that. So I suppose you'll have to tell me a little bit about the string quartet. Movements in a string quartet. What's a rondo form? We spent some time learning about what rondo form is. Yeah, just kind of go over your notes from class. I try not to pull any fast ones. You all know that. If I didn't talk about it at all, it won't show up on the quiz. I would also take a look at maybe contrafactum and musical appropriation. Those are terms that we talked about when we were looking at Haydn's string quartet, that second movement. Because remember, the tune of that second movement was from a more famous tune he had written for somebody else. And we talked about what musical appropriation and contrafactum was and some other examples of those things. So those would be good, just basic ideas to have in your head for this quiz. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email, and I will see you guys on Wednesday.